The first one that I want to talk about is clarity. As you think about clarity, clarity is foundational, it's fundamental. But the deal with clarity is that in the absence of it, people will create their own story. Think about it in your business and think about it in your world, how often people create their own stories. I mean, it's happening probably on a daily basis. And when that happens, those stories will continue to be created until there's a way in which employees can get the right level of clarity. And our role as leaders is really to help move them towards that. And so as we think about that particular topic, and Melissa, if I could have you turn to the next slide. As you think about that particular topic, what stories are created in your business? I want you to think about it in the context of the what and the how. Fundamentally, the what behind clarity refers to a results-oriented orientation. Some questions that you may want to think about would include what are your organization's unifying goals, particularly in those times where there is uncertainty. What objectives or key results are expected from individuals, from teams, from functional areas, from organization at an organizational level. Individually, what are my performance objectives? What actions and behaviors did we just decide during different meetings and different opportunities to connect? So the what is really around the results orientation. The how refers to the behavior. If we know the what, then the how comes into play culturally. What behaviors do we believe are the right behaviors to demonstrate in terms of how we work with one another? What are the norms that guide how we will run our interactions and how our meetings? And so when you bring the what and the how together, it creates what I call ACE, alignment, connection, and engagement. When clarity exists, people have a better chance to align themselves to what they're doing and how they contribute to the organization. When they can align themselves, there's a greater opportunity for them to connect what they are doing and feel connected. And when they feel connected, there's greater ownership that exists. And so think about the what and the how during times of uncertainty and times of change. Creating responsibility is and clarity is not a one-way street as well. And so as we think about this particular scenario, what is the right level of clarity? What are the questions? What are the questions that need to be asked? And we look at the power of questions and how you might use them in your leadership brand. One of the questions that I use quite often with employees and leaders, and particularly during the last 15 months, is if the right level of clarity existed for me or for you today, what would I know differently than tomorrow than I do today? And then based upon that answer, where does clarity exist at this time? It provides an opportunity for individuals to really think through, where do I need that clarity? And so I want to end this particular piece by providing you some practices to create clarity and remove uncertainty. First of all, the right mindset. Having the right mindset moves beyond just problem orientation. It's a balancing problem orientation with outcome orientation. And so what that means for us is to broaden our perspective and take a more systematic approach to operating in the right level. It's not just about our function, it's about looking horizontally and helping employees look horizontally, having the right skill sets to break through the clutter, demonstrate empathy, harness the power of storytelling during these times of uncertainty to create and illustrate messages that resonate, listen well, and ask the right questions, and really focus on unifying individuals through common goals. And then most importantly, give and receive feedback, because giving and receiving feedback that is transparent builds trust. And people are looking for that during times of change and times of uncertainty. At an organizational level, where's the organization going at this time? I'd offer you 6 questions to think about. 1, why do we exist? This question gets at the reason for the existence and the core purpose. How do we behave? This question gets at core values and looks at the cultural aspects of the business. What do we do? I mean, what is it that we do? What is our mission? What service do we provide? And is it our core service? How will we succeed? This looks at our strategy and our plan for success and how we will measure it. What is most important right now? What is most important for us to stay ahead of? This question looks at what our top priorities are and who must do what. This prioritizes work and leverages strengths and natural tendencies during these times. And so as we think about clarity, really it aligns to connection. Clarity creates connection. And so with that, I want to turn the second practice over to Melissa.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Good morning, everyone, and we're happy to be here. So when we talk about staying connected, one of the things that when we were thinking about this is just thinking back on the last 15 months and how we have had to be so intentional to stay connected and that it's been hard, right? So most of us could show up at the office, we could go meet people outside to have a happy hour or meet for a working lunch. And that ability to stay connected has been something that we have had to take a very intentional approach to stay connected, whether it's with our teams, with our leaders, with our peers, and just with humans in general. And so, as we move forward, talking about the need to feel connected and valued, I wanted to say a quick quote from Brené Brown. So she says, I define connection as the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued. And I thought that really resonated with this on just our ability to be connected, to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued. So, in our first point, talking about isolation and that ability to stay connected when we're working remote, we're feeling some of those isolation feelings and how that really adds to that uncertainty, anxiety, and fear. And so, one of the things to think about around isolation is how do we recognize it? How do we, as leaders or business owners or employees, recognize that we're feeling that isolation and recognizing those feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, or fear? And at the core of it, people need connection. People need to feel connected. And so there are those that we would call ourselves introverted and those that would call ourselves extroverted, but we all have that need to feel connection, regardless of where we are on that extrovert introvert spectrum. And so the other thing to think about on this is most people will not ask for help. It's hard at times, especially when you're allowing yourself to be vulnerable and say, I need help. I'm feeling isolated. How can I feel more connected within my role, with my team, with my leaders, right? And so one of the things that I would pose as a question is, how do you recognize that someone needs help? How do you recognize that someone needs support where you reach out and work on making that additional connection with them? The next topic, this is something that I heard just recently, and I thought it was a really interesting analogy or picture to think about this last 15 months. And it was called a period of cocooning. And so when you think about the last year and a half, how we have kind of gone within, right? So we're in our homes, we're cocooning with those people that are our core group of individuals. I've heard people say, well, our cocoon pod or our safe pod is these couple families within our neighborhood, right? So whatever that looked like for you, what and who are included in our new way of life, or another way of saying it, our new normal. And so when you come out of that period of cocooning, what are you going to continue to do? What are the things you're going to add back onto your plate? And that connection, right, of who's going to be included in that period when you come out of that cocoon. One of the things that I think about with this period of cocooning is, even when you think about the what and who are included, how do you do things to create that additional connection? And one of the things Gary and I were talking about is with our current clients, how they're doing that. So when I think about how you stay connected and valued, a few things that I'm hearing from clients are surrounding team huddles. So they're doing team huddles differently or more frequently to create that connection, even though it's virtual. One-on-ones with their team members, but also one-on-ones with peers and leaders, so that we're making that extra effort to stay connected while we're in this period of working from home and showing up for meetings, and making those one-on-ones that really have nothing to do with maybe a topic or a situation they're working on, but just that connection. The other one I heard recently is, as folks are starting to go back to the office and looking at what this back to work plan looks like, taking 20 or 30 minutes out to go take a walk with one of their peers to stay connected and get out of the office, and get themselves in a mindset. They're in fresh air, they feel comfortable, right? And they're doing that as far as one of the ways that they're staying connected. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is, how do we offer space for our employees to share their emotions? And so one of the things that I wanted to start with is just the word space, right? And when we think about, I think this applies to many things, and you might hear me say this a little bit later in our conversation, is just our definitions, right? So Gary's definition of space could be very different than my definition of space. And so at times, thinking about when you're talking about a word that could have various definitions, how do you, with your team or your peers, really say, well, can you share your definition of space and what does that mean to you? And the definition matters, right? So if I'm assuming for Gary, space means giving him an extra 10 minutes of alone time to get something done, and his definition of space is very different than that, we are working towards a common goal, but not on the same page, right? So that's very important. So when I think about space, it could be pausing, it could be giving time back, it could be frankly just stepping out of that situation and allowing some reflection time. The other thing I wanted to talk about here was around business and personal. So a lot of times we hear the phrase, well, it's business, it's not personal. And what I would challenge is that while emotions, yes, it is business, it's not personal, but emotions come into play whether you're in the office or outside of the office. And how do we give that space? And when you think about emotions in the workplace, how do you acknowledge that emotions happen, right? We all know that emotions happen, but there are times where I've heard leaders say things like, well, I don't want to deal with that. They're crying. It's too much. I can't handle it. Well, in that moment, and especially in these times of uncertainty, how do we embrace the emotions that are happening? Acknowledge that they're happening. It doesn't mean that that you get in the trenches with that, but finding out what's going on and digging a little deeper about how can you support that individual, because we are in uncertain times, and how we deal with it and navigate it and building that team environment is very important. So this one's interesting. How do we support each other in solution-focused partnerships? So one of the things here, and really what I want to talk about, is just solution-based. So when you think about solution-based, it's future-focused and it's a goal-driven approach. It is not focusing on the problems. And then the word here of partnerships. Partnerships means together. It means doing it as a team. So when you're thinking about things you're working on, how are you working on them as a group to focus on the future and what you're trying to do and having that goal-oriented approach and that whole thought of partnership? It's not us as a leader saying this is what we're going to do, but how do we work together to increase that feeling of connection and the value that all of the team members bring to the plate. Okay, so the last one on this part of feeling connected and valued in our Stay Connected section is just how do you create meaningful connections? And we've been talking about some of the ways. One of the things to think about is non-update meetings. So how do you have quick meetings or even set meetings, whether it's a 15-minute or a 30-minute, where it's really a meeting to stay connected? How are things going? What's going on? And then how do you take those questions? So if I were to say to Gary, hey, how's things going? What's going on? And Gary gives me an answer, right? Things are going great. Do you take it at surface level, or do you take that next level question and say, what else is going on? Tell me more, right? Tell me more is a great way to get people to just share a little bit more. And creating those meaningful connections and asking that next level of question is so important. One, you're going to have your team feel like they're really being heard. And while I was looking at meaningful connections and reading things that we share with our clients and whatnot, one thing that came, I'm looking over to the right because I wrote it out, was Dr. Audrey with Mind Cafe gave 7 ways that you can increase connection. So I'm going to read them out. So one was reaching out. How do you reach out and make connection and make that extra time versus someone having to pop by your office or jump onto your Skype or ping you saying, hey, do you have a quick minute for me? 2, thinking about the time and place. So is it a time when it's mashed between a bunch of meetings in the day and you're going to be very busy or over indexed and there's other things you're thinking about that you need to get done? Listen, and active listening, right? So are you listening to respond, or are you listening to actually hear what the person that you're meeting with is talking about? That's super important. And active listening is absolutely a skill. It takes a ton of practice. And I don't mean it to sound flippant, but I always thought as a leader, I was a really good listener. And then when I moved into leadership and executive coaching, I realized I had some work to do, right? And so that ability to really listen without thinking about what you want to say and just hearing what they're saying is so important. Our body language, right? Are we fidgeting? Are we looking like we need to look at our phone? We hear it buzz and we're looking over. So what is our body language saying about our ability of being present in that moment? Eye contact. Are you making eye contact? Are you watching everything that goes by, right? A phrase that people say, squirrel, right? Like, are you looking around as things are going on, or are you in that meeting and making good eye contact? deeper questions. So we talked a little bit about this. How are you asking? What is the next question you asked after that surface level information is provided or shared with you? And then engaging with your emotions. So being okay and comfortable with allowing ourselves to be a bit vulnerable. That doesn't mean I'm saying that you should be, crying in your meeting, right? That's not what I mean by emotions, but what emotions are you bringing to the table as you're engaging in that conversation? Okay, so building and sustaining relationships. Let's keep moving forward. And as Christina said, if you have questions and you want to put them into the chat, we will address them at the end so that we can make sure that we don't run out of time, but we also want to answer your questions as we get moving. So building and sustaining relationships. So when we talk about staying connected, how do you stay connected? Building and sustaining relationship, that is that next level, right? That is going deeper. And so one thing I looked up, which I found interesting, was there's a Harvard study on adult development. It's the longest existing study on physical and mental health. It's been going on for 80 years and counting. It's still going. And one of the things that they're looking at is findings on friendship and relationships. So I'm going to read what they said here. Close relationships more than money or fame, right? I'm going to read that one more time. Close relationships more than money or fame are what keep people happy throughout their lives. Those ties protect people from life's discontents, helps delay mental and physical decline, and are better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, or even genes. And I think it was really relevant because it talks about the power of, so money can buy a lot of things, right? And fame, some people really like fame, some people don't want to be fame, but that close relationship piece and really tying it to the power of building and sustaining relationships, regardless if this is in the office or outside of the office. So let's jump in. So talking about double down on relationships. So Gary talked about trust earlier. And when we talk about double down on your relationships, I think about trust. I think about people want to work with and be around people that they trust, like, and know that, right? That they know you at a deeper level than just showing up at the office and I'm the leader or I'm a peer on your team. And so one of the things that was taught to me a long time ago around trust is it's like a bucket of water, right? And over time, we build trust by these individual drops of water in the bucket. And trust also, that bucket can get kicked over very quickly. And that entire bit of drops of water that you've put in the bucket have been lost in a very quick instant. And so when you think about doubling down on your relationships and that trust, likability, and sharing just who you are and building on how you know each other is critical and important when we're moving forward. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about here is really how are you managing your situations and emotions? And what I mean by this is how are you reflecting? Most of us as individuals really can be reactive, right? And I've been in that place. And so it's that, how do you take whatever you're in the moment? And when you think about this, how do you think about just pausing, reflecting, stepping out of the current state? And what I mean by that is if something hits a trigger with you, right? And you're all of a sudden having that emotional reaction, how do you step out of that and pause? Whether it's getting yourself out of the office. I've heard people take a tact of, I'm going to walk out of my office. I'm going to walk around the office. I'm going to step outside and get some fresh air. But when you're having a situation that occurs, how do you navigate or recognize that you're having an emotional reaction to it? And what do you do to put yourself in a state of reflecting and pausing before you move forward? Thinking about resilience, acknowledgement, and sharing successful practices. Resilience. What does resilience mean to you, right? So thinking about in the workspace and in the workplace, what does it mean to be resilient in your business or in your leadership style, or resilient with your team, resilient in this time of uncertainty, right? The past 15 months. Acknowledgement. How do you acknowledge others and yourself? But when I think about this, I even think about acknowledging your current state. And what I mean is where you're at right now. How do you also acknowledge someone else's current state? Where do you recognize that you're seeing that there's an emotional reaction that's happening? And when do you acknowledge that you need to have added extra effort? So as we talked about, there are things that happen, and how do we acknowledge that? And just ask that deeper question, right? When we're talking about building relationships, adding that question back in about, hey, I see that something looks like it's going on. Is there something I can support you with, right? Like giving that space for them to share what's going on and building that relationship. And then on the sharing success stories or successful practices, realizing that we're not in this alone. So one of the great things about Des Moines Partnership or chambers or other groups or people that you mentor with or networking groups you're in is how do we share what's working and what's working well? We don't have to reinvent the wheel, and how do we share the things that have been working really well with others as they're moving through this time of uncertainty for sure. Okay, so this one, how do you encourage your employees to build and sustain relationships? So for me, this one is really around modeling, right? And I think Gary joined back into the call. I don't see him yet. I was going to ping over to Gary about a practice he used when he was at Principal with encouraging his employees to build and sustain relationships. One thing for me, I really think about modeling. So how are you modeling? Speed of the leader, speed of the pack is a phrase I've used for a long time. And how do you model that behavior that shows your team that you're building and sustaining relationships and they see the importance of that you give? The other phrase that I've had is around give, ask, receive. So I've always been in the mentality of if I give first, right? So if I'm putting money in the bank, that at some point when I need to ask for help, I'm able to take that withdrawal from the bank and utilize that as I'm not that you're taking money from the bank on relationships, but what are you giving out? What are you putting out there? And what deposits are you putting in that relationship bank with the other humans that you're engaging with? So I think that's really important. And I see Gary is back. So Gary, I was going to ask if you would share how you worked at Principal to engage your team to build and sustain relationships.
Yeah, you bet. My apologies. My internet just went out, and so I'm on my backup. So hopefully this will continue to work. What I did is I implemented an expectation, and I went to my department, and I was doing that. In my first 3 months at the Principal, I met with almost 80 people just to build the networks. And so I said to my team, what I want you to do is each quarter I want you to reach out to 3 individuals that you don't know. And then I'm asking that you report back to me at the end of each quarter. That could be scheduling at 10 or 15 minutes or sending me a quick paragraph. Who did you meet with and what did you learn? And of course, when the first one introduced this, I got a bunch of eye rolling and I got the proverbial, we don't have time. But I will tell you, after about 2 or 3 quarters of doing this, I didn't have to remind anyone. They found the value in not only building those relationships, but learning more about the business. And so my hope is the practice still continues. And so that just demonstrates that it's so important to incorporate that into your ongoing development.
Thank you, Gary. That's a great example. Absolutely. So last thing I want to talk about here is just a bit of reflection, right? So if you think back to March of 2020, and if you want to add this in the chat, feel free to do so. But if you think back to March of 2020, whether you remember it as March 13th or March 15th, whatever day that was that we went on lockdown, what word would you use to describe your relationships at that point in time? And as I was thinking about this and reflecting even for myself, when I think back to March 2020, I found my relationships were thriving. They were rich. They were full of fun, right? There was lots of dinners planned in the evenings. You were going out, you were going to different fun events or, events that were sponsored throughout Des Moines. And it was fun to reflect back on how it was. And then now looking forward, it's May of 2021. How has your word changed? So if my word was thriving, and how has your word changed during this time of uncertainty? My word that I used was stronger. And while that may seem like an interesting word, the word is around the relationships that I've maintained and the relationships that I've doubled down on. They are stronger, right? Because I've made that added effort, including things like FaceTime calls to stay connected. So it's not just a text or a phone call, right? Having that visual connection with those people that are important partners, whether partners in business or just people within my life that are important. So I'm going to look at the chat and see what's going on up there. Let's see if anyone has entered any of their words. Not as of yet, if you want to throw your words in. So I went from thriving to stronger. And Gary, I don't know if you want to throw in your 2 words, and I'm putting you on the spot because I didn't tell you I was going to do that. But if you think back, what would your words would have been to what it is now?
Yeah, I would call they were fun. They were consistent. Today they're different. I mean, they are. That's not a negative, but they are different because the last 15 months it has really changed the perspectives of individuals. Another one would be excited, just at that we're moving more towards a post versus a pre-COVID timeframe.
Absolutely. No, thank you for jumping in. And with that, speaking of things that we are, putting effort, right, and doubling down on, I'm going to turn it back to Gary to talk about being intentional.
Yeah, the fourth practice is about being intentional, and there's a difference between being intentional and being event-based in your leadership. And when we deliver our leadership series, we talk about and ask that question: would you describe your leadership as intentional or event-based? And the first thing I want to share with you, and I'm taking some excerpts from a leadership refresher series that we present to clients on, and one of the topics being intentional leadership, is that being intentional is holistic. There's a direct correlation, folks, between how you practice intentionality and the behaviors that you demonstrate and work on a daily basis outside of work, to how that carries forward and into your role as a leader of people within your organization. And I would tell you that the actions and behaviors will trump impressions or perceptions. We should be thinking about the actions and behaviors we want to demonstrate that move us towards intentionality. And so the first question I'd ask you to reflect on is how are you demonstrating intentional behavior outside of work? A couple of examples. Choose to be kind. There's a difference between being kind and being nice. Being nice has the potential for individuals to perceive it as not being authentic or genuine. But when you choose to be kind, you're making an effort to really go above and beyond for another individual, and it's outside of you. Practice active listening, that we talked about that as well. Another one is make time for self-reflection and journaling. The question I would pose to you, if you had 10 minutes every day, 10 minutes set aside for reflection and journaling without distraction, and the topic was you, what would be included on the agenda? And as you think about the percent of time, minutes, there are 10,080 minutes in a week. 10,080 minutes in a week. You spend 10 minutes a day, that's 70 minutes. That's less than 1% of time. It can be very valuable if you build that in a habit. Question your have-tos. The difference between a have-to and a get-to is a mindset. And it's a mindset of enthusiasm, of energy, of engagement. And all have-to scenarios have the ability to transform into a get-to. And so if you had to create a top 10 list of your have-tos, what would be included, and which of those have an opportunity for you to move to a get-to? And the final thing on the outside of work is prioritize rest and self-care. And I would just ask you, how do you know when you need self-care? As a leader, look inward with an outward focus. You got to take care of your own house before you can help the neighborhood. What are your warning signs? What type of self-care do you need in the moment? So think about it holistically, which takes us now into the next piece, which is how do you demonstrate intentionality within the workplace? And I want to share three practices. One, trust your team and your teammates to do their best work. How often do you talk about the art and science of trust? Every client that I work with incorporates the word trust into their commentary. Trust is important. We need to build trust. Not many clients go beyond that and explore trust. What are the actions and behaviors that we need to demonstrate in order to make a choice to choose someone as trusting? How are we assessing it? How are we measuring it? How are we creating actions and behaviors to address it? I have very few clients who take it one step further, and I encourage you to think about how you are going beyond just using the word trust in your vocabulary. Put a premium on courage and empathy. When you think about being courageous or showing empathy, it is a choice. It's a choice that has internal and external sequencing. You have to choose internally. You have to choose to be courageous or choose to demonstrate empathy. Your external environment will then move you to the direction of how you will incorporate it into your leadership. And so think about your external environment. Authenticity, resilience, emotional intelligence, self-discipline, commitment to purpose are all components of courage and empathy. But I love this trust, try, trust, tell. Bill Treasure from Giant Leap Consulting talks about implementing this into an organization. Try is the courage of action. of really taking the step to do that and knowing that it's okay if it doesn't work. Trust is the courage of relying on others. It's the demonstration of humility. How do you demonstrate humility in your leadership to others? And tell is the courage of voice and the truth telling. How transparent are you? How transparent is your organization? How open are you in your communication in the way in which you interact with one another? And then the final bullet is to encourage genuine, what I call genuine perspective taking. And that is the process of incorporating both thinking and emotion. You think about it in terms of the perspective, then that creates the emotion. And so there are two components here that you really need to consider. But the key operative word here is genuine. Encourage genuine perspective taking using a try, trust, tell. And then the last component of practicing authenticity is make space for bigger conversations and possibilities. Whether we realize it or not, as individuals, we establish boundaries, picket fences, if you will. And as part of the teams, we also establish those same types of boundaries. And as we think about it, those boundaries determine what we allow and what we don't allow in terms of our dialogue, in terms of what we believe is normal in the way that we interact with one another. So the tighter the boundary or the picket fence, the greater the likelihood that the conversation is not incorporating collaboration, innovation, connection, trust. And so my question to you to think about is, what boundaries have you and your team created? And if you move that boundary or that picket fence a few feet farther back, how would that impact your ability not only to be intentional and to really focus on clarity and to focus on intentionality and connection and relationship? What are the opportunities that exist both at an individual and collective level? Which leads us to our final practice. So when you think about this final practice, reflective leadership, what does that mean? I had mentioned there are 10,080 minutes in a week. And so as we think about the concept of reflective leadership, the idea here is I want you to think about the number of conversations you have in your lifetime. The vast majority of them are with yourself. They're with your internal voice. And when you talk to your internal voice, if there isn't a process or a way in which you can really think through and reflect in situations, meaning you're much more reactive, then there's a greater likelihood that your leadership and the way you show leadership during times of change and uncertainty will incorporate a level of anxiety, hesitation, even potential fear, maybe frustration. And so for those who don't have that mechanism, that becomes a much more common outcome. What we talk about in modeling reflective leadership is to have a process in place in which when you have those conversations internally, you are reflecting that allows you to learn. You'll see at the very top here of the slide, experience plus reflection, and it really should be experience and reflection. You have to have both to learn. You can't have an experience and not reflect and expect to learn at the level you want to learn. And you need an experience in which to reflect. Experiences happen all the time. It's your choice to choose. Will you be reflective or will you be reactive? And so when you think about reaction without reflection is a red flag. And the reason that we call that a red flag is because reaction is generally something that happens without thinking through. And so we talk about the concept of incorporating self-awareness. And is your self-awareness, how is your self-awareness tested? Well, in times of change and uncertainty, it's tested quite often, not only within yourself, but as employees come to you with questions about what's going on, what's the direction, what should we do, how should we approach that? And so in the spirit of all of that interaction, of that change, that uncertainty, triggers will be surfaced. The question on the screen here, what are your emotional triggers which move you to distraction? If we gave you 15 seconds to identify your top 4 triggers that move you, that create emotion, that move you to distraction, would you be able to do that? We find our experience in our leadership series, and we've delivered this to almost 2,000 employee leaders. At least half, if not more, are not able to do that because they haven't reflected on what those triggers are. We have emotions that surface all the time, and some of them I call them flyby triggers. They happen and then they're gone. But we all have 2 to 3 to 4 triggers that will produce an emotion that moves us to distraction. And so the opportunity here and the concept behind reflective leadership is to put something in place that allows us to stay in the reflective or responsive mode and not the reactive mode. And so 3 questions that we use, particularly when we're coaching, are listed up here. What is important for me to know in this situation? What is important for me to ask in this situation? What is important for me to share in this situation? And when we say in this situation, that could be any situation. And what's really important to know here is the word important. It's not what do I need to know, what do I need to ask? It's what's important for me to know or ask or share. Because in many situations, what is important for me to know, ask, or share may not be what I really want to, what I need to know based upon it being focused on me. During times of change and uncertainty, you want to take care of yourself through being intentional. We talked about that in a holistic manner. When you are in a leadership mode with your employees, it's really what's important in this particular situation. And so I encourage you to think about how that works. Now, that is a skill that is learned, and I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa. It's she and I have worked together for quite a few years, and she's shared with me stories in which this is an ongoing learning process for her. So, Melissa, if you could share a quick
Sure.
example, that would be great.
Yeah. So, and thanks for the opportunity. When Gary and I were talking about this, a story popped into my head very quickly around what's important to know, to ask, and to share, and how I did not have that practice in my abilities at that point. So I'm going to take us back over a decade, more than a decade, to I think I was probably 27 years old, and it was one of my first times of being a leader. I was leading people, and I had been an entrepreneur and started small businesses, but they were my businesses, right? I made all the decisions and I just went forward. So it was one of the first times I was leading agents, insurance agents. And my boss at the time, our leader at the time, brought me into his office and he said, Mel, you need to go speak with Sam. And his name was Sam. And you need to tell him if he doesn't do this by this date, his contract is going to be terminated. And as a 27-year-old, new in leadership, regardless of age, I took that as what I needed to do. And instead of reflecting and saying, what is important for me to know about what's going on with Sam in this moment to achieve his numbers or to validate his contract per se, what is important for me to ask, right, in that situation? And what was important for me to share with him? I had that meeting with Sam. And I will always regret this meeting, but I learned a very valuable lesson, right? That experience plus reflection. I went into the office and I repeated Gary, my boss, and I literally said, Sam, if you don't hit these numbers by this date, your contract is going to be terminated. Well, that was a terrible thing to say, right? Like I wasn't supportive. I wasn't asking what's going on with your situation now? How can I help you? What do we need to do to help you move towards this thing? And so I just think it's an interesting example of, we all learned some hard lessons along the way. That was a very valuable leadership lesson of what not to do, right? And if I would have had these 3 questions in my tool bank, arrows in my quiver per se, I would have approached that situation in a much different manner than I did back then. And so with that, Gary, I don't know if you want to wrap up this section and then we can move to Q&A with the group.
Yeah, I want to close out just with a couple of comments. The topic of this presentation is really focused on during times of change and uncertainty. The reality is that the 5 practices that we've been talking about are practices that should be a part of leadership, regardless. It's just they're so much more prominent and important, and they matter so much more during these times of where people are looking for answers. And so the idea of getting to the right level of clarity, and in the absence of that clarity, people are going to create their own stories. And so as a business leader, a business owner, what are you doing to minimize and or eliminate, but minimize the stories that are being created? And then, we talked about connecting, making connections. It's one thing to meet, and that is a connection, but having meaningful connections. Fundamentally, employees want to feel connected and they want to feel valued. So how are you approaching that so that people feel that they feel connected, they feel valued to what is happening within the business at that time? We talked about building and sustaining relationships, networking with a purpose. Melissa talked about the importance of relationships as a foundational human component of energy, enthusiasm. And so how are you continuing your efforts to build and sustain the right relationships? And how are you helping your employees recognize and the importance of doing the same? We talked about being intentional versus event-based. It is holistic. And how are you incorporating intentionality into just your being that then can translate into your leadership that really says, this is my authentic self and I'm making an effort to do that. And then finally, how are you using reflection? How are you focusing on asking yourself the right questions so that you're staying away from a reactive mode and more to a reflective and responsive mode? So we hope that that there are one or two good nuggets that you could take away from our presentation. And with that, we would turn it over to questions that we'd welcome answering.
Yeah, so if you're on, feel free to turn your cameras on and join the conversation. If you have a question, you can feel free to go ahead and ask it, or if you'd like to ask it in the chat confidentially too, I can always share that. But please feel free to jump on and share any questions that you may have. I can ask one question I know that was hanging out down here. I was going to save it for later. It did come in confidentially to me. How do you survive when your leader doesn't lead by example?
Great question. Melissa, you want to take a shot at that?
Sure, I'd love to. You know, the thought that comes back is we've all worked for really great leaders, and we've all had an opportunity, likely in our career, to work for someone that we don't want to emulate their style. But in those moments when we're working with someone that doesn't necessarily resonate with leadership style, or they don't lead by example, I think it's our opportunity. And Gary and I have said this before, we all have a responsibility for leadership, whether we're in a leadership role or not. How do we show up and show leadership? And so my recommendation is to be your authentic self and your leadership style, and model that behavior for those around you. And you know, my best advice is, don't start chameleoning what your leader, if you see them as not emulating great leadership, don't start following in those footsteps. It's easy to follow what you see being done. And I would just give a big kudos on the fact that you recognize that you don't find it to be a great leadership style, and knowing that's not how you want to be as you move forward or move up, or do have your authentic leadership style. That's what I would add to the room. Mm-hmm. Gary, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I would offer leadership and moving to one's authentic self is an ongoing journey. Mm-hmm. And there will be times when certain things happen and we take a step backwards on that journey. If we've begun it and we know where we want to get to in terms of our core values, what's important to us, how we want to demonstrate consistency, even in those step backs, where it's much easier for us to move back on our path. It's just those individuals that haven't begun that journey, when these things happen, and an example is being with a leader that is not leading by example, we don't know where to turn. And so now we are commensurating in the negative aspects or the non-productive aspects of that leadership style. And so I encourage individuals to really think about and ask themselves the questions: what is my true authentic self? And how do I move forward towards that, knowing that it'll be an ongoing journey and there will be some setbacks. And that will generate greater consistency. And then the second question, the thing that I encourage folks to think about is, if you are with a leader that is not leading by example, do you have an opportunity to help that leader be better? If you don't have an opportunity for that leader to be better, then you need to think about, is this the right environment for me? Based upon what my beliefs are, how I want to contribute. And that's an easy question for me to say to folks, but in the moment it's a hard one. The reality is that I have faced that in my career. Melissa has faced that in her career. And the good news for us, that we talked about this before, is that we had begun our journey of what is our authentic self, and that made our decisions a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. Really great question.
Any other questions on the line?
Here's one that popped up. How does this discussion map to recruitment? We have hiring headwinds across Iowa.
Can I take a shot at that
Sure.
first, Melissa?
Of course, yeah.
And there's recency to this one for me. I was with a client, one of my clients, and we were in in-person meeting. We're talking yesterday, as a matter of fact. And here's what came up. Just the idea of if you have an organization that is flexible and open to hybrid working scenarios, etc., what you now need to think about is the fact that if you are open to that, your map, your geography to recruiting has now just expanded. Now the thing about that is now where they're going to have to, they're struggling to think through, and they don't have the answer yet, is what are the market pricing implications? If I'm hiring someone to do a job for us that's out of a market where their pricing is 40% higher than what we would pay here, how am I going to handle that? And so it's kind of a sequencing that's happening for clients that I work with. Is all right now, wow, this is great. We're just not our focus, our scope is not just this particular area. And now our market's going to expand exponentially. Oh my gosh, they're going to ask for double salary. So I think that's one of the components of the post-COVID that many clients didn't think about in the beginning, but now that is starting to becoming full circle. Hope that answers. I think that was Ryan.
Yeah.
By the way, good to see you, Ryan.
Yeah. It's a
Well,
great
anything you want to add?
Great question.
Yeah, the thing I would add is, so I think to a client who was applying for roles, right? And when she was working on her resume to get it ready to go, she said, I'm going to apply for roles I would never usually apply for, because with COVID, it's opened up this opportunity that I can be remote, and leaders have discovered, or they're embracing currently, that they can have team members wherever, right? Whether it's international or just within the States, and they don't have to be sitting across the desk to get their job done and to be effective. So I think people that are applying for roles too are thinking, they're expanding their box of, I don't want to move from Iowa, but I'm open to work for a company in California if they're open to me being remote or flying out once a quarter. So I think it's on both sides of the fence created more opportunity. But yeah, how do you navigate that, right? When you put remote, what does that really mean when you're recruiting? So yeah, that's great. And I know, I think it was Evan, but I could be making an assumption there. E. White said, thanks for distilling it into 5 practices. So thanks for that comment. Any other questions out there? I know we have about 5 minutes left. Everyone's always happy to get a few minutes back before they jump into their next Zoom meeting, as we were talking about how do we start adding travel time back into our lives as moving back to work in the whatever our new normal looks like. But if there's any other questions out there, we'd be happy to answer them.
I'm just looking for the hot take on virtual offices as a long-standing practice. I mean, I was on a call with our global offices yesterday, and nearly half of them, their workforces do not want to ever go back to an office environment. So to the earlier question about recruitment and to all of the things you had to say about leadership, what do you already see as different about a virtualized office setting?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. I'm seeing a couple of things. One, interestingly enough, the way in which you survey employees and engagement, the types of questions that are being asked are very different. Secondly, I think there's initial hesitation by many employees now that is this a permanent thing? I want to continue it in this capacity, but what if ultimately I don't like it? Does that mean what am I giving up? And so employers are going to really need to be clear when they talk about getting to clarity about the fact that maybe this isn't necessarily a one and done. We're going to evaluate this going, and you will have options going forward. Third, just the employee asks, will you buy some furniture for me? Will you help? I mean, just those little things, but they do add up. And then finally, I actually have a client who's senior. I mean, executives are thinking about moving out of the state and still wanting to do their job, because why wouldn't I be able to do my job? So now they're looking at relocation. And there are just any number of scenarios that are going to come into play that employers are just going to have to, in many situations, think through as they go and address as they go before they get to a point. I think we're 12 to 18 months out before any really concrete policies that employers can be established around virtual. And it's just you've got to remain flexible and open now, and address it as you go before you really have enough data and information to make something more formal. That's what I'm hearing from my clients.
I was going to add a question onto that, because I did have a client ask me that was debating on bringing them back. And, you talked a lot about trust, and their fear was, by bringing people back to the office and beginning this discussion, that they were going to break trust, because the employees, now their fear internally was the employees would question, well, why don't they trust me to work from home when I've been doing it for 15 months? So do you have any feedback on that, of how to approach that without breaking trust? Because this is literally the fear that this entrepreneur has in approaching this discussion with their team.
Yeah.
Melissa, anything you want to share there?
Yeah, Christina. So even back to Gary's last comment, I think about the office situation, whatever transpires, is it goes back to Gary's thought about the have to versus get to. Like, do people feel like they have to do something, or do they get to? And so how do we, transparent communication comes to line. Are we open to allowing certain people to work from home and others to come back to the office? And prior to jumping on the call, Christina, we were talking about some people are better at home, and some people really working at home is not their most effective self. The distractions keep them, and they have a preference. So I also think about the companies that are willing to be the most flexible, adaptable, and transparent in this, whatever the new normal looks like. They're going to have the world is their oyster, right? Of talent, right? Because they're open and more engaging in what they're willing to work with. And those companies that get to that place, this is my opinion, where you have to come back to the office, employees know that there's choices now. And so, how important or valuable do you place on people, right? And I think people are the most important part of companies. We do the work and we bring the passion to what happens. So how are you going to work with your people and just have clear communication with them on options, right? And being open to options.
Yeah, if I could tag on to that real quick, finding with many clients is that this is not a one-way street. There's an accountability on the employee. And what they call it's just to build a business case for their request. So many employers are saying, I'm more productive, and they very well may be more productive. But but some businesses say productivity is great, but what's equally and not more important is connection, collaboration, thinking, connecting across. So they're asking their employees to complete even an application. I get that you will stay connected to your vertical, your team. How will you approach staying connected to those outside? How will you work with others to in a collaborative spirit? And they're really asking employees to think about that. They're saying, we absolutely would welcome you to work in this environment. But please know that it's not just about productivity. It's more holistic. And so some employers, clients are asking the employees to really give thought to that.
All right, guys. Well, it is 10 o'clock on the dot. I know we could keep going all day, but this has been recorded. We have a lovely blog from both Melissa and Gary. So we will wrap up the day, get it edited and up online for you to share with any of your teams. So thanks for joining us. Gary and Melissa, thank you so much for your valuable time today. And we will be back online next month with our top 5, the last week in June. So we will see you all soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.